Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the biggest mistake of your life is the only reason you finally find your way home. Las Vegas glittered like it always did, dazzling enough to make people believe that every impossible dream could come true before sunrise. Neon lights spilled across crowded sidewalks. Music echoed from rooftop bars, and strangers laughed together as though tomorrow didn't exist. Tessa Holloway had never liked gambling, but tonight wasn't about chasing luck. It was about saying goodbye to the worst year of her life. At 27, she had spent every spare dollar keeping her late grandmother's tiny apartment, surviving freelance illustration jobs that barely covered rent, and pretending everything would eventually work out. Her best friend insisted one weekend in Las Vegas would help her forget the constant pressure, if only for 48 hours. Tessa smiled through the exhaustion because smiling was easier than explaining how close she was to giving up. Inside an elegant hotel ballroom, guests celebrated a lavish corporate charity event while another wedding reception ended just across the hall. People drifted from one room to another, champagne glasses changed hands, photographers shouted directions, and every doorway looked exactly the same. Tessa excused herself to find the restroom, clutching the worn leather sketchbook she carried everywhere. Its edges were faded, several pages had come loose, but it held every dream she had never been brave enough to chase. As she rounded a corner, a hotel employee hurried past carrying a stack of decorative signs, apologizing before disappearing into another hallway. One sign slipped sideways. Another pointed in the wrong direction. Tessa followed what she thought was the exit and walked straight into a private ceremony already in progress. A smiling officiant glanced toward her without hesitation. "There she is," he announced warmly. Several guests applauded. Tessa froze. Before she could explain, she had entered the wrong room. Another voice interrupted. "We're running behind schedule. Let's continue." She turned toward the tall man, standing only a few feet away. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, yet his expression carried none of the excitement expected from a groom. Instead, his blue eyes revealed quiet exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying responsibilities no one else could see. This was Callan Whitmore, although she had no idea who he was. He stared at her with the same confusion she felt, but cameras were already flashing. An elderly woman dabbed tears from her eyes. Someone whispered that the family lawyer had finally made it. The officiant gently placed Tessa's hand into Callan's. She tried to speak. "I think there's been please," an anxious event coordinator whispered. "Just another minute." Everything happened too fast. The officiant recited formal words neither of them truly heard. Guests smiled. Pens appeared. Papers were signed. Photographers celebrated another perfect moment. Tessa's pulse hammered in her ears while Callan remained strangely calm, studying her face as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had appeared without warning. The instant the final signature touched the page, she stepped backward. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I walked into the wrong room." Silence swallowed the ballroom. The coordinator looked horrified. The officiant blinked twice. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. Callan slowly accepted the official marriage certificate from the clerk without taking his eyes off her. "You mean," he asked quietly, "you weren't supposed to be here?" Tessa shook her head so quickly a loose strand of blonde hair slipped across her face. "No, I don't even know your name." For the first time that evening, Callan almost smiled. It was brief, barely noticeable, yet somehow genuine. "Then," he replied, folding the document with impossible composure, "I think we both have a much bigger problem than either of us expected." Neither of them realized that one legal signature had just tied together two completely different worlds, and before the sun rose over the Nevada desert, one of them would desperately want their freedom while the other would refuse to let it go. The ballroom emptied faster than either of them expected, leaving behind scattered flower petals, half-finished champagne glasses, and one question neither could answer. Tessa stared at the marriage certificate as though it belonged to someone else. "This cannot possibly be legal," she whispered. The hotel coordinator nervously explained that every required document had been verified electronically before the ceremony. The officiant had followed state procedures exactly. Their signatures had been witnessed. The license had already been filed through the county's digital system. What everyone believed was a planned wedding had become a perfectly valid marriage. Tessa felt the room tilt beneath her feet. "Then we fix it," she said quickly. "We go wherever we need to go first thing tomorrow morning and file for an annulment." Callan remained surprisingly composed. He thanked the staff, dismissed the photographers with quiet professionalism, and waited until they were finally alone in a private conference room overlooking the glowing Las Vegas Strip. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Tessa tightened her grip on her old sketchbook, searching his face for anger or frustration, but found neither. He looked thoughtful instead, almost as though he were calculating possibilities invisible to everyone else. "I am sorry," she said sincerely. "I never wanted any of this." "Neither did I," he answered calmly. "But wishing it never happened will not change the paperwork." She folded her arms. "Then tomorrow morning we end it." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No," one simple word stopped the conversation cold. Tessa blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no." She let out a nervous laugh because the alternative was impossible to accept. "You cannot just refuse." "Actually," he replied evenly. "For the moment, I can." Her patience disappeared. "You do not even know me." "That is true. I walked into the wrong room." "Also true. Then why would you want to stay married?" Callan turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Thousands of lights stretched across the city below like stars scattered over the desert. "Because if we dissolve this marriage immediately, the consequences will reach far beyond either of us." Tessa frowned. "I have absolutely no idea what that means." Before he could answer, his phone vibrated repeatedly. The screen filled with missed calls from executives, attorneys, and family members. He silenced every notification without reading them. "Would it help if I finally introduced myself?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Because right now I feel like I accidentally married a stranger." He nodded once. "My name is Callan Whitmore." The name meant nothing to her. She looked genuinely confused, and for the first time that evening he realized she truly had no idea who he was. Most people recognized him immediately from business magazines or financial news interviews. Tessa simply waited for an explanation. "I own Whitmore Capital." She offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry. I should probably know what that is." Instead of looking offended, Callan almost laughed. Most people pretend they know. He opened his wallet and handed her a simple business card. The elegant black lettering reflected the city lights. Tessa read it once, then a second time, before searching his name on her phone. Within seconds, photographs filled the screen. Headlines described billion-dollar acquisitions, charitable foundations, and one of the youngest chief executive officers in the country. Her eyes widened. "You are that Callan Whitmore?" "Yes." She slowly lowered the phone. "This keeps getting worse." "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps more complicated." She stood and paced across the room. "Look, I do not want your money. I do not want your company. I just want my life back." He believed her immediately, and that unexpected honesty made the decision even harder. After a long silence, he spoke with unusual sincerity. "There is a clause in my grandfather's estate plan. If I appear incapable of maintaining certain family obligations during the next 6 months, control of the company can be challenged by members of my board and extended family." Tessa stared at him. "You are telling me your company depends on this marriage?" "Not exactly." He met her eyes without hesitation. "But ending it tomorrow. Morning could begin a legal battle that affects thousands of employees." She shook her head in disbelief. "So what are you asking me to do?" Callan took one careful breath before answering the question that would change both of their futures. "Stay married to me for 6 months, and after that, if you still want to walk away, I will never stand in your way." Tessa could not remember how she agreed to anything after that conversation. The next morning arrived with bright desert sunlight pouring through the hotel windows, making the unbelievable events of the previous night feel even more real. She sat alone in a quiet cafe across the street, stirring the same cup of coffee until it had gone cold. Her phone displayed missed calls from her best friend, overdue client emails, and reminders about bills waiting back home. Across from her lay a neatly folded document prepared by Callan's legal team. It was not a controlling contract filled with impossible conditions. Instead, it simply outlined practical arrangements for the next 6 months. She would keep her own bank account. She could continue working as an illustrator. She would not be expected to change her career or give up her independence. At the end of 6 months, Callan would personally handle every legal step necessary to end the marriage if that was still what she wanted. She read every page twice before looking up as Callan entered the cafe wearing dark jeans, a navy sweater, and no security detail. Without the expensive suit, he looked less like a billionaire and more like an ordinary man who had barely slept. He quietly ordered black coffee before joining her table. "You actually came," he said. "I almost did not," Tessa admitted honestly. "I still might leave." "You would have every right." She studied him carefully. "Then why do I feel like you already know I will not?" He smiled faintly. "Because you listened yesterday when I talked about the people who depend on my company." She sighed. "That was not fair." "No," he admitted. "It was not." Silence settled between them until Tessa finally reached into her bag and pulled out her worn sketchbook. She opened to a page filled with unfinished pencil. Drawings of small neighborhood coffee shops, children playing in parks, elderly couples holding hands, and ordinary moments most people never noticed. Callan looked at each page with genuine curiosity. "You drew all of these?" "Whenever I have a free moment." "They are beautiful." She laughed softly. "Beautiful does not pay rent very often." He continued turning pages carefully, making certain not to damage the worn corners. "You notice things other people ignore." "That is probably because I have spent my whole life being ignored." Her words lingered longer than either of them expected. Callan slowly closed the sketchbook and returned it to her with unexpected care. Nobody should overlook talent like this. She looked away, uncomfortable with compliments from someone who seemed to live in an entirely different universe. An hour later, a private jet carried them from Las Vegas toward New York. It was Tessa's first time flying on anything other than a commercial airline. She remained near the window, watching endless clouds drift beneath them while wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life twice in less than 24 hours. When they landed, a black sport utility vehicle waited beside the terminal. The drive carried them through quiet, tree-lined roads before iron gates slowly opened to reveal the Whitmore estate. Tessa instinctively leaned closer to the window. The property stretched farther than she could comfortably see. Carefully maintained gardens surrounded a timeless stone mansion with tall columns, wide terraces, and floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the afternoon sun. She whispered the first thought that entered her mind. "People actually live here?" Callan glanced toward the house, without pride. "Sometimes it feels more like they simply pass through." Inside, the residence felt even larger than it appeared from outside. A house manager greeted them warmly. Several staff members welcomed Tessa with quiet professionalism, never asking uncomfortable questions or making her feel out of place. She expected whispers or judgment, but found only courtesy. As she followed Callan through polished hallways lined with family photographs and original paintings, she noticed something surprising. Despite the elegance surrounding them, the house felt strangely empty. Every room was perfectly arranged, yet nothing suggested laughter, late-night conversations, or ordinary family memories. It looked less like a home and more like a museum built to impress visitors. Callan stopped outside a bright guest suite overlooking the gardens. "This room is yours for as long as you choose to stay." Tessa stepped inside carrying only one suitcase and her old sketchbook. She placed the sketchbook carefully on the bedside table before turning toward the window. Somewhere beyond those gardens lay a world she understood. Inside these walls waited 6 months she never planned to live, alongside a man she barely knew but somehow trusted just enough to take one uncertain step forward. Tessa expected the first week inside the Whitmore estate to feel like living in someone else's dream, but instead it felt like learning the rules of an unfamiliar country. Every morning began with quiet efficiency. Breakfast appeared precisely at 7:30. Fresh flowers decorated the dining room before sunrise. Meetings filled Callan's calendar with such precision that every minute seemed to belong to someone else. Yet despite the size of the estate and the number of people working there, the house remained remarkably silent. It was the kind of silence created by routine rather than peace. Tessa continued working from the sunlit guest suite overlooking the gardens. She answered emails from longtime clients, finished children's book illustrations, and filled new pages of her old sketchbook whenever inspiration appeared. The house staff quickly learned that she preferred making her own tea in the afternoon instead of asking someone else to bring it. They also noticed she thanked everyone by name, something that surprised people accustomed to remaining invisible. Within days, the gardeners smiled when she stopped to admire the roses. The kitchen staff quietly set aside fresh blueberry muffins because they discovered they were her favorite. Even the elderly butler seemed amused whenever she accidentally wandered into another hallway and became lost in the enormous mansion. Callan noticed every small interaction without saying much. During the day, he disappeared into endless board meetings, investor calls, and strategy sessions that often stretched well past sunset. When he returned home each evening, he looked more exhausted than when he had left. His perfectly measured public confidence faded the moment the front doors closed behind him. One rainy evening, Tessa wandered into the estate library, searching for a quiet place to sketch. She found Callan standing alone beside the fireplace, still wearing his suit jacket, staring at the flames without reading the open folder resting on the table beside him. "Long day?" she asked gently. He looked up, almost surprised someone had spoken. "They usually are. You have not eaten dinner." He glanced at his watch as though only then realizing the time. "I forgot." Tessa smiled. Normal people usually remember food before 10 o'clock. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I am beginning to realize I have not lived like a normal person for a very long time." She walked toward the kitchen and returned a few minutes later carrying 2 bowls of homemade tomato soup and warm grilled cheese sandwiches the chef had prepared for the staff. "This is all I could find without asking anyone to cook again," she said. Callan stared at the tray before quietly laughing, a genuine laugh that seemed unfamiliar even to him. "Nobody has brought me grilled cheese since I was 12. Then someone has seriously neglected you." They ate in comfortable silence while rain tapped softly against the tall windows. For the first time since arriving, the mansion felt less like a museum and more like a home. As the evening continued, Tessa noticed framed photographs displayed along one shelf. Most showed Callan attending award ceremonies, business conferences, and charity events. Very few included family. "Were you always expected to run the company?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Since I was old enough to understand what responsibility meant." "Did anyone ever ask what you wanted?" He looked into the fireplace instead of at her. "Not that I remember." Something inside Tessa quietly shifted. Until then, she had seen only the billionaire everyone admired from a distance. Sitting across from her now was simply a man who had spent years carrying expectations heavier than anyone realized. Before leaving the library, she noticed an empty page in her sketchbook and quickly drew the fireplace, 2 soup bowls, and a pair of untouched business folders resting beside them. She did not realize Callan was watching until she finished. "You draw ordinary moments," he said softly. "Those are usually the ones people miss." He nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is why they matter most." As she closed the sketchbook, neither of them understood that the distance between a fake marriage and genuine friendship had quietly become much smaller than either was willing to admit. 3 weeks passed before Tessa truly understood what it meant to stand beside one of the most recognizable business leaders in the country. Every public appearance became another performance, another carefully photographed moment proving that the unexpected marriage was stable and genuine. She smiled for cameras, shook hands with strangers, and learned to ignore headlines speculating about her mysterious past. Most people accepted the story without question, but not everyone welcomed her into Callan's world. One Friday afternoon, his executive assistant reminded them about the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the largest charitable event hosted by the family each year. Nearly 1,000 guests would attend, including business leaders, journalists, artists, and members of Callan's extended family. "You do not have to come," Callan said as they reviewed the schedule in his office. "If tonight feels overwhelming, I will understand." Tessa looked up from her sketchbook. If we are supposed to look like a married couple, disappearing before the biggest event of the year would probably send the wrong message. He smiled appreciatively. "You are becoming surprisingly good at this." She answered with a playful grin. "Do not get used to it." That evening, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, filled with elegant conversations and polished speeches. Tessa wore a simple midnight blue gown, chosen because she felt comfortable in it rather than because it carried a famous designer label. She walked beside Callan with quiet confidence, but she immediately noticed curious glances following her across the room. Some guests welcomed her warmly. Others smiled politely before whispering to one another the moment she walked away. During the reception, Callan was repeatedly pulled into conversations with investors and board members, leaving Tessa alone near a display of paintings created by young scholarship recipients. She studied every canvas with genuine admiration until a sharply dressed woman approached carrying a glass of sparkling water. "You must be Tessa," the woman said with a practiced smile. "I am Vanessa Whitmore, Callan's cousin." Tessa offered her hand. "It is nice to meet you." Vanessa accepted the greeting, but her smile never reached her eyes. "I have to admit, your story is remarkable. 1 month ago, nobody knew your name. Now you are standing at the center of one of the country's most influential families." Tessa recognized the hidden meaning immediately. "Life can change unexpectedly." "Indeed," Vanessa replied. "Some people spend decades building a legacy. Others simply marry into one." Before Tessa could respond, 2 nearby guests fell uncomfortably silent. She realized they were listening. Vanessa continued with perfect politeness. "Tell me, what exactly qualified you to become Mrs. Whitmore?" For a brief moment, embarrassment flushed across Tessa's face. She could have defended herself. She could have argued. Instead, she glanced toward the scholarship paintings surrounding them. "Nothing qualified me," she answered honestly. "I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Everything after that has been a choice, and I am still trying to make the right ones." Vanessa gave a small, skeptical laugh before excusing herself. Although the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, it left Tessa questioning whether she truly belonged anywhere inside this world. Later that evening, the host announced that the featured artwork scheduled for the charity auction had been damaged during transportation and would not arrive in time. Guests murmured with disappointment as organizers hurried backstage searching for a solution. Without a centerpiece, the foundation risked losing hundreds of thousands of dollars pledged to children's education programs. Tessa quietly walked toward the event coordinator. "May I borrow a drawing board, some charcoal pencils, and heavy paper?" The coordinator looked confused but agreed. While musicians continued performing and guests enjoyed dinner, Tessa settled into a quiet corner of the ballroom and began drawing. Her pencil moved with calm confidence, capturing the faces of children laughing together beneath a wide oak tree, their dreams stretching beyond the edges of the page. People gradually gathered around her, watching the illustration appear line by line. Even conversations across the ballroom began to fade as curiosity replaced distraction. 45 minutes later, she signed the finished artwork and handed it to the auctioneer without making a speech or asking for recognition. The bidding started modestly before climbing higher and higher as guests competed to support the foundation. When the final bid exceeded every expectation, the ballroom erupted into applause. Standing near the stage, Callan looked at Tessa with unmistakable pride. She had not impressed the room with wealth, influence, or status. She had done it with quiet talent and genuine generosity. For the first time that evening, everyone stopped seeing the woman who had accidentally entered the Whitmore family and began seeing the remarkable person she had always been. The days following the gala felt different in ways neither Tessa nor Callan mentioned aloud. Reporters praised the foundation's record-breaking fundraiser. Newspapers published photographs of the charcoal illustration that had inspired the highest donation of the evening. And for the first time, the headlines focused less on the unusual marriage and more on the woman whose quiet talent had united an entire ballroom. Tessa tried to ignore the attention and return to her normal routine, spending mornings finishing illustration projects and afternoons sketching in the estate gardens. She believed life had finally settled into something predictable until one rainy afternoon changed everything. She wandered into the west wing of the mansion searching for a quiet room after a sudden storm forced her indoors. Most of the hallway lights were dimmed, and the walls displayed decades of Whitmore family portraits. At the end of the corridor, she noticed a study with its door slightly open. She hesitated before knocking softly. Receiving no answer, she stepped inside, intending only to admire the shelves filled with old books. Instead, her attention settled on a large wooden desk where several folders had been left open beside framed photographs. She immediately looked away, unwilling to invade Callan's privacy, but one familiar image caught her eye. It was a newspaper clipping from Las Vegas dated the morning after their unexpected wedding. Curiosity overcame hesitation. She carefully lifted the clipping and realized someone had folded it many times from frequent handling. Beneath it rested another photograph taken outside the hotel only minutes after the ceremony. In the picture, She looked completely overwhelmed while Callan stood beside her watching with an expression she had never noticed before. It was not frustration. It was not embarrassment. It was quiet admiration. Tessa slowly turned another page and discovered handwritten notes in Callan's neat handwriting. The words were simple enough to stop her breathing for a moment. She is exactly the same when nobody is watching. Kind. Honest. Completely unaware of who I am. Do not lose that. Before she could process what she had read, footsteps approached behind her. She immediately closed the folder and turned to find Callan standing in the doorway. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. "I am sorry," she said softly. "The door was open. I should not have come in." Instead of appearing angry, he walked toward the desk and gently rested one hand on the closed folder. "You found something I was not ready to explain." She searched his face. "Those notes were about me." He nodded. "Yes. You told me you wanted to stay married because of the company." Another quiet nod. "That was true, but it was not the whole truth." Callan looked out the rain-covered window before answering. "The moment you told me you had entered the wrong room by accident, I realized you were probably the first person in years who spoke to me without wanting anything from me." Tessa remained silent. "Everyone else already knew my name before introducing themselves," he continued. "You did not. You looked at me the same way you would have looked at any stranger standing in that ballroom. Because that is exactly what you were." "I know." He smiled gently. "And somehow that made me wish the mistake had not happened." Tessa felt her heartbeat quicken. "So when you asked me to stay, I did need to protect the company," he admitted honestly. "But I also hoped 6 months might be enough time for you to decide whether the person behind the headlines was worth knowing." She lowered her eyes, unsure how to answer. Every assumption she had made since Las Vegas suddenly felt incomplete. Before either of them could continue, Callan's phone rang sharply. His expression changed the moment he answered. He listened without interrupting, then slowly thanked the caller and ended the conversation. "What happened?" Tessa asked. He looked toward her with unmistakable concern. "Someone has been investigating our marriage." "Investigating?" "One of my relatives hired a private investigator. They believe they have found evidence proving the wedding was an accident." Tessa felt the room grow very still. "But it was an accident." "Yes," Callan answered quietly. "And if they convince the board that our marriage was never intended to be real, everything we have protected these past weeks could begin falling apart." As thunder rolled across the sky outside the mansion, neither of them realized the greatest challenge was no longer pretending to be husband and wife. It was deciding how much of what had begun as an accident had quietly become the truth. Tessa barely slept after learning someone was trying to dismantle the life they had unexpectedly built together. Every conversation from the past several weeks replayed in her mind, especially Callan's quiet confession that he had wanted to know the woman behind the accident long before she had begun. Believing there was a kind man behind the billionaire. The following morning, the Whitmore estate felt unusually tense. Attorneys arrived before breakfast. Board members requested emergency meetings. Reporters gathered outside the front gates hoping to capture even a single photograph that might confirm the growing rumors. Tessa remained upstairs, looking out the window while gently turning the simple wedding band around her finger. It had begun as little more than legal evidence of a mistake. Somehow it now carried memories she was not ready to lose. Late that afternoon, she passed the library and overheard part of a conversation through the partially open door. One attorney spoke carefully. "If the investigation convinces enough board members that the marriage was never intended to be genuine, they may challenge your authority under the estate provisions." Another voice added, "The company could survive, but the legal fight would take months, perhaps longer." Callan answered with complete calm. "Do whatever is necessary to protect the employees. They should never suffer because of my personal life." Tessa quietly stepped away before anyone noticed she had been there. She wandered into the garden carrying her old sketchbook, but for the first time in years, she could not draw a single line. Instead, she stared at the blank page and asked herself one impossible question. If staying beside Callan endangered everything he had spent his life building, was holding on to her own happiness worth the cost? That evening, Callan finally found her sitting beneath the large oak tree near the edge of the property. "I have been looking everywhere for you," he said softly. She smiled, though her eyes revealed the sadness she could not hide. "I just needed some quiet." He sat beside her without speaking. The silence between them had become comfortable over the past several weeks, but tonight it felt painfully fragile. "You are thinking about leaving," he said at last. Tessa did not answer immediately. "I am thinking about what is best for you." He looked directly at her. "What is best for me is not the same as what everyone else believes." She lowered her eyes. "Maybe not. But I cannot be the reason your family's company falls apart. You are not the reason. Then why does everyone keep acting like I am?" He reached for her hand, his voice steady and sincere. "Because it is easier to blame the person who arrived unexpectedly than the people who spent years creating these problems." His words nearly broke the determination she had been building all afternoon. For one brief moment, she wanted to tell him she no longer cared about the agreement, the headlines, or the 6-month deadline. She wanted to stay. Instead, she remembered the anxious faces of the attorneys and the thousands of employees whose futures depended on decisions made far above their heads. The next morning, Callan left before sunrise for another emergency board meeting in Manhattan. Tessa waited until his car disappeared beyond the front gates before walking quietly into his study. Resting on the desk was the folder containing the legal agreement they had signed weeks earlier. She opened it carefully, added one final signature to the prepared divorce papers, and slipped them neatly inside. Beside the folder, she placed her wedding ring and her worn sketchbook. Between its pages, she left a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me that kindness can exist in places I never expected. You once told me that I could walk away after 6 months if I wanted. I am leaving early because I think it gives you the best chance to protect everything you have built. Please do not come looking for me. I hope one day this house becomes the home you deserve." Carrying only a small suitcase, Tessa quietly thanked every member of the staff who had welcomed her from the beginning. Many tried to convince her to stay, but she simply smiled through her tears and stepped into the waiting taxi. Hours later, Callan returned home after successfully postponing the board's decision. For the first time in days, he believed the worst might finally be over. He walked into the study expecting to tell Tessa the encouraging news, but instead found only the signed divorce papers, the wedding ring reflecting the afternoon sunlight, and the old sketchbook resting exactly where she had left it. As he slowly opened the note hidden inside its pages, the silence filling the mansion felt heavier than it ever had before, because the one person who had transformed the estate into something that finally resembled a home was gone. Tessa rented a small apartment above a neighborhood bookstore nearly 3 hours from Manhattan, in a quiet town where nobody recognized her face from magazine covers or charity galas. The apartment was modest, with creaking wooden floors, a tiny kitchen, and a narrow balcony overlooking maple trees that swayed gently in the summer breeze. It reminded her of the life she had known before Las Vegas, except nothing inside her felt the same anymore. Every morning she returned to freelance illustration, answering emails from longtime clients who had no idea she had spent the past several months living inside one of the country's most influential families. She smiled through video meetings, finished deadlines, and tried convincing herself that leaving had been the right decision. Yet every evening, she reached for her sketchbook before remembering she had left it behind on Callan's desk. For the first time in years, she had nothing familiar to draw in. Without the sketchbook she had carried everywhere, every blank page felt strangely unfamiliar. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore estate, silence had returned with a force Callan had never imagined possible. The staff continued performing every task with flawless professionalism, but the warmth that had quietly filled the mansion since Tessa's arrival had disappeared. The afternoon tea tray no longer sat near the garden bench. Fresh blueberry muffins remained untouched in the kitchen. Even the gardeners admitted the estate somehow felt colder despite the bright summer weather. Callan carried Tessa's sketchbook everywhere he went. During long board meetings, he occasionally opened it to the pages she had filled with ordinary moments that everyone else overlooked. There was the drawing of grilled cheese beside the fireplace, the charcoal sketch from the gala before it had been framed, small studies of gardeners trimming roses, kitchen staff laughing together, and sunlight stretching across empty hallways. Looking through those pages, he finally understood what Tessa had seen from the beginning. She had never been impressed by wealth. She had simply searched for humanity wherever she happened to be. 1 week after her departure, the emergency board meeting finally arrived. Several directors questioned the legitimacy of the marriage after learning about the accidental ceremony in Las Vegas. Vanessa quietly supported every accusation, convinced the relationship had been carefully staged to protect Callan's authority. The chairman eventually turned toward him. "Do you have anything to say before this board votes?" Callan stood slowly, placing Tessa's sketchbook on the conference table instead of a legal folder. "Yes." The room fell silent. The wedding began as an accident. That part is true. But everything that happened afterward was a choice. He opened the sketchbook to the page showing the simple meal beside the fireplace. "This woman reminded me that leadership is not measured by quarterly reports or market value. It is measured by the way people feel when they walk into a room you have built." He turned another page showing the smiling gardeners. She thanked employees whose names many executives never learned. Another page revealed the charity illustration. "She raised more money for this foundation in 45 minutes than I could have inspired with 100 speeches." Finally, he closed the sketchbook gently. "If any of you believe that choosing someone with integrity weakens this company, then perhaps the company has forgotten why it deserved to exist in the first place." The room remained completely still. One by one, several directors quietly lowered the documents they had prepared against him. Even those who disagreed found themselves unable to challenge the sincerity of his words. Hours later, the vote concluded. Callan retained full authority over Whitmore Capital, and the investigation officially ended without further action. Yet instead of celebrating, he walked directly to his office and removed the unsigned divorce papers from his desk. Without hesitation, he fed every page into the paper shredder, watching months of fear disappear into thin strips of paper. Then he looked once more at Tessa's handwritten note resting inside the sketchbook. She had asked him not to come looking for her. He remembered reading those words dozens of times, hoping they would somehow become easier to accept. Instead, they only confirmed one truth he could no longer deny. She had walked away because she loved him enough to protect everything he cared about. Standing alone beside the office window overlooking the city skyline, Callan slipped the wedding ring back into his pocket, picked up the worn sketchbook she thought she had left behind forever, and quietly smiled for the first time since she disappeared, because he had finally stopped searching for a way to save his company and started preparing to find the only person who had ever made success feel secondary to coming home. 2 days later, Callan finally found the town after following nothing more than a return address printed on one of Tessa's freelance invoices that had arrived at the estate by mistake. He left his driver behind and walked the final blocks alone, carrying only the worn sketchbook and the simple wedding ring that had remained in his pocket since the day she left. The quiet street smelled of fresh coffee and summer rain. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while customers wandered in and out of the neighborhood bookstore beneath Tessa's apartment. It was exactly the kind of place she would choose, somewhere ordinary enough for people to know one another by name. Through the bookstore window, he saw her sitting at a small wooden table, sketching while an elderly customer smiled across from her. She looked peaceful. For the first time in weeks, he understood why she had chosen to disappear there. She belonged wherever kindness mattered more than status. He waited until the customer left before stepping inside. The small bell above the door rang softly. Tessa looked up automatically, and the pencil slipped from her fingers the moment their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. "You were not supposed to come looking for me," she whispered. Callan smiled gently. "I know. Then why are you here?" He placed the old sketchbook on the table between them. "Because you left the one thing that taught me how to see my own life." Her eyes settled on the familiar worn cover. She carefully touched it as though greeting an old friend. "I wanted you to keep it." "I cannot." He shook his head. "Every page belongs to the woman who drew it." Tessa looked away, afraid that if she met his eyes again, she would lose the determination that had carried her this far. "The company is safe now?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "The investigation is over?" "Yes." She nodded with visible relief. "Then leaving was worth it." Callan took a slow breath before answering. "No, Tessa. Losing you was never worth anything." She finally looked back at him. "You still have everything you worked for." "Not everything." He reached into his pocket and placed the wedding ring beside the sketchbook. "I kept waiting for these 6 months to end because that was our agreement. Then I realized I had stopped counting the days a long time ago." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she remained silent. "You once asked whether anyone had ever cared what I wanted," he continued. "I did not have an answer then. I do now." He smiled with quiet certainty. "I want mornings where someone reminds me to eat breakfast." I want grilled cheese on difficult days instead of another business dinner. I want someone who thanks every employee by name and sketches ordinary moments because she understands they become extraordinary when shared with the right person. Tessa laughed softly through her tears. That sounds nothing like the life of a billionaire. Maybe that is because I finally learned the difference between being successful and being happy. He gently opened the sketchbook to the final blank page. You never finished this one. She looked down at the empty paper. I did not know how the story ended. Callan reached into his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Instead of opening it immediately, he rested it on the blank page. Neither did I. He took her hand with quiet confidence. The first time we got married happened because we walked into the wrong room. I do not want our future to begin with another accident. He opened the box, revealing a simple diamond ring that reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bookstore windows. Tessa Holloway, will you choose me this time? Not because of a contract, not because of a company, not because of a mistake, but because we found something neither of us expected? She looked at the ring only briefly before meeting his eyes again. Yes, she whispered, but only if you promise me one thing. Anything. She smiled through happy tears. Never let this house become another museum. Callan laughed, the sound warm enough to make several customers glance over with curious smiles. I promise. Months later, the Whitmore estate looked different in ways no architect could have designed. The gardens overflowed with children visiting foundation art programs. Employees gathered comfortably in rooms that had once felt silent. The library displayed Tessa's sketchbook inside a glass case only after she finished filling every page, including the last drawing, which showed 2 coffee cups resting beside a simple wedding ring beneath the words "home was never a place. It was always a person." Their story was never remembered because a billionaire accidentally got married in Las Vegas. It was remembered because 2 people from completely different worlds proved that kindness could cross every social boundary, that true leadership always began with humility, and that the greatest promise either of them ever made was not spoken during an unexpected ceremony, but during the ordinary afternoon when they finally chose each other on purpose. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.